what makes great level design? More specifically, Resident Evil's level design. Resident Evil is a long franchise spanning many generations at this point. Also, it hasn't been a smooth and bump-free road through its entirety either. So which game specifically has Resident Evil done level design exceptionally well in? To proceed, we must first establish what makes level design quote-unquote good. I'd argue that it really isn't that difficult to have good level design. Great level design, absolutely. So we're throwing out Resident Evil 5, 6, and Code Veronica because for reasons I'm about to discuss, aren't the greatest in level design. But before I get way too ahead of myself, back to what makes good or great level design. Let's just throw in games from other series that have great level design, beyond that of Resident Evil. I'll use a couple of examples. Obviously, there's a lot more, but I'm going to keep it simple and stick to just using Half-Life 2 and a newer release in Stray, everybody's favorite cat game. Valve, as you may know, in old tales of folklore, once upon a time made video games like that of Half-Life 2. When making that game specifically, game commentary from level designers mentioned that something that makes great level design is having a focal point for the player to reference and adhere to throughout the game. Half-Life 2 does this by using the Citadel, aka the giant-ass tower skyscraper in City 17 as that reference. Through a large majority of that game and its, for now, hint hint, 2 DLCs, you can usually see that giant tower throughout the entirety of the game and at points in the DLC. Now sure, there's times where you won't, but when you get to a new location and all of a sudden you see it again, and it's closer or either farther away, you have that point of reference. You feel as if you've traveled in a direction in this game's universe. The story also structures around this, making it more impactful as well. The level design always tethered to this design element. We know as a player is important, and the level design maintains that premise throughout. Great level design. Also, the layout of the levels matters as well, especially the use of space, but I'll tackle that more later on. Older games tend to be empty due to hardware limitations, so Stray will be a better and more up-to-date game for that purpose. So let's transition to that game specifically. Stray doesn't operate quite in the same fashion as Half-Life 2 in great level design. It's like an orange compared to Half-Life's apple. Both fruit, but not the same thing. Stray's level design operates more in, the final destination roughly, but you have to traverse a great distance to get there. No spoilers, of course, but Stray starts off with a stray family of cats, and one is separated from the group and left to figure things out. You know that the cat likely wants to regroup with the others, but you also have a journey ahead and are left in unknown territory. Stray has you traverse a lot of hardships built upon this beginning premise, but also allows the cat to grow and develop as an individual, meeting many new faces along the way. The level design is great as it creates a great sense of being alone and abandoned at the beginning. The sewers and hostile and dangerous abandoned cities create this hardship, but when you finally do come across friendly individuals, it means that much more. That relationship is enhanced because of that desperation. Pacing in Stray's level design is very important. Since it's a pretty short game as well, that pacing has limited windows, and the level design traversing very different narratives throughout is exquisitely and perfectly timed. Stray and Half-Life 2 both do something spectacular as well that a lot of games don't bother with. That would be elevation. No, I don't mean just sitting in an elevator. Levels that go up and down, not just flat planes to cross. So now we have a vague idea of what loosely makes great level design, more or less. So that you understand why I think of Resident Evil 5, 6, and Code Veronica as bad design, I'll quickly go over that and dive into the Resident Evil games that are developed greatly in design. So, first of all, the problem I have with Resident Evil 5 and 6 is the fact that they are laid out like arcade levels. Really just crammed into a room to be all tossed aside to the next set piece of a room. Kill some enemies, move on to the next, and repeat. It requires little thought and planning out. Now, if I used tips from great level design that we mentioned earlier, maybe we'd see the volcano at the end of Resident Evil 5 in the distance near the start of the game. Maybe the cargo ship that's on the second half of the game would be visibly present earlier within the game. Maybe locations had more meaning and presence within them, more time and details to add value to the levels themselves. And since Resident Evil 6 is just basically Resident Evil 5 on steroids, being absolutely batshit crazy, it adds little of value, being nothing even remotely coherent. I did mention Code Veronica as well. A lot of the problem in that game lies more in concept and execution than in planning. Not really any issues like Resident Evil 5 or 6 at all. The mansion and jail cells are barely used, even though the story makes it seem very important. Capcom incorporated strange and weird set pieces like a submarine and a fighter jet.
Hold on, Claire. I'll save you.
Instead, should have leaned more into the mansion and the prison theme more so, instead of the weird and nonsensical. The set piece level design becomes way more apparent in this game compared to that of Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, where a remote mansion and city structure makes sense. Even Resident Evil 4, 7, and Village use their building designs and focal points way better. Resident Evil 4 is in fact spread out, but you still know there's a starting village, find out about a castle, proceed to said castle, find out about a military training facility island, and then decide to go to that island. Logic in the next destination. So we've cleared out the information on good and bad level design. Sure, there's finer details like how rooms are laid out, but instead of an hour-plus long slog through fundamentals of design, consider this the express option. The game I want to focus in on most is one part Resident Evil 2 Remake and another part Resident Evil 1 Remake. These two games exemplify the best in level design for all of Resident Evil. There's limits to flaws, and I'd say Resident Evil 4, 7, and Village are good, but not by any means close to perfect either in design. Resident Evil Remake and the 2 Remake do certain things much better than the rest of the franchise. One is balancing and really getting a chance to live in the horror of the situation. A lot of Resident Evil games abandon the setup before it gets time to be fully fleshed out and appreciated. Or, in some cases, truly terrified by it.
What in God's name?
The mansion and the RPD police station are the main culprits of Resident Evil's success. The Resident Evil 3 remake has the RPD, but it's limited in use and more of a trend Resident Evil seems to do in making it a temporary set piece. More so in the remake of 3, as in the original, you navigate the streets around it more as well, A huge reason everyone was upset with the remake was the clock tower, which is Resident Evil 3's focal point building structure, as Resident Evil 2 claims fame to the RPD. Reusing the RPD as a focus would be bad and feel cheap to the player, as if no effort went into making the game. Instead, we see it as a nostalgic and familiar but not overdone set piece. The amount of time we spend in the mansion in Resident Evil 1 and the RPD in Resident Evil 2 feels as if we're stuck in them. There's horrific monsters surrounding both of them. We have little resources to make it through. The level design literally locks us in locations as we try to escape room our way the fuck out. We get that time to figure out and appreciate the inside structures through narrow and tight corridors, uncomfortable and uneasy to traverse. We also get that verticality in design. Multiple levels to each of these buildings, increasing time spent within them. More chances for terror to occur. Uneasy sounds to be heard. If all we do is run away from point A to B to C, without getting stuck in A or having to unlock B, we get a shallow and narrow experience. Somewhat humorously, if you take the label off of the RPD and call it a mansion again, you get a pretty similar result as the first. Same if you throw in Resident Evil 7's house. Being trapped inside the location builds that tension. You don't have nearly the amount of tension and anxiety if it's just a pit stop towards the next pit stop.
Come on, let's get out of here.
Here's the part I really streamline instead of going a full hour at it. We mentioned a few components of great level design, but of course there's a lot more to it than just those. Other aspects that make great level design are atmosphere, use of space, audio cues, not going into audio, but it is a factor, length of interactivity, and environment interactivity, such as a pipe breaking and steam pouring out, or in Resident Evil 3, Nemesis breaking through a wall, etc. And of course, how fun it is to actually go through the damn thing.
Ugh. Chew on that, you overgrown son of a bitch.
A lot of games like to use visual cues to guide players, typically a colored ledge that sticks out to travel and traverse on, blood trails to follow, neon signs pointing the way. It comes in many different forms. Of all of these things I just mentioned, the best Resident Evils deliver on a horrifically tense atmosphere, not to be confused with an overwhelming amount of enemies, which is anxiety more so, but a creepy vibe, a spine-tingling sensation in what seems like an empty hallway, throwing the player off of expectations. The original Resident Evil did this a lot with audio and environmental design. Things like a quiet hallway being disrupted with a loud thunder from outside, with lightning shining through the trees, briefly illuminating the terror around you. Resident Evil 2 uses more of a city, noise, and monster structure, trying to get into the RPD. Games later on in the series abandon these types of important nuances. Resident Evil 5 and 6 don't do anything beyond throw enemies at you. The levels are bland, and even if the overall environment might be somewhat interesting at first, it gets dull and repetitive quick because it repeats the same things, uses the same explosive barrels over and over. There's nothing that is unique or interesting in the finer details of the levels. Like Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and Village, all have paintings that allude to more history and depth of characters and locations. Sometimes it's a poster or a trinket that has purpose. The environment creates mysteries, and if you look close, can answer lingering questions or add more depth. It's more than just a pile of trash for you to go around until you fight yet another enemy. Great level design has attention to detail and shows a story beyond the bare minimum, creating intrigue. If you take anything away from this video besides the fact that I think that Resident Evil 5 and 6 are rubbish, at least hopefully you start to pay a little bit more attention to that detail in games, because it is there in a lot of them, not just Resident Evil. It's all done with a reason. Typically, as most gaming studios want to make the best game they can, even if it doesn't work out that way. There usually is a lot of artistic choice and planning in the design and detail of the game you're playing, no matter what it may be, Resident Evil or not.